Christmas bread. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Just this statement. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, a Jewish lady named Mrs. Rosenberg, who many years ago was stranded late one night at a fashionable resort, but one that did not admit Jews. But she was stranded and needed a room. And the desk clerk looked down at his book when she asked for a room and said, "Sorry, there is no room. The hotel is full." The Jewish lady said, "But your sign says that you have vacancies." And the desk clerk stammered around and then said very disrespectfully, "You know that we do not admit Jews." Now, if you'll try the other side of town, Ms. Rosenberg stiffened noticeably and said, "I'll have you know I have been converted to Christianity." And the desk clerk said, "Oh yeah? Let me give you a little test. How was Jesus born?" And the precious lady replied, "He was born to a virgin named Mary in a little town called Bethlehem." "Very good," replied the hotel clerk. "Tell me more." The precious lady replied, "He was born in a manger." "That's right," said the hotel clerk. "And why was he born in the manger?" She thought for a second. She said, "Because some jerk like you in the hotel wouldn't give a Jewish lady a room." We know the story of Bethlehem and what happened there, don't we? Very, very clearly. But of all the cities and towns and the villages in Palestine, why did the Lord choose such an unheard of hamlet called Bethlehem for his son to be born in? If a site committee had been appointed to find the proper place, the name Bethlehem probably would not have come up. Maybe the city of Hebron. It played an important role in the beginning of the Hebrew nation because of Abraham and Jacob and Joseph and later David. All of them were associated with that place. On the other hand, maybe the committee would have said, "Well, we really need to keep it in Jerusalem to have Mary have her baby." But, you know, and there's always Nazareth where Joseph and Mary lived. Why wasn't the baby born there? And we know because they had to travel to their native place to be taxed. But Micah chapter 5 verse 2 says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you were little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler of Israel, whose going forth are from old, from everlasting to everlasting." Talking about Jesus. So for whatever reason, God designed Bethlehem to be the place of the birth of the Savior. And it was here that Israel's great and ideal king, the poet, the hero, if you would, King David was born and grew up. Before that, a most beautiful love story came forth from Bethlehem. You know the story of Naomi and Ruth, how from famine to famine they had to go place to place to find enough wheat to make bread. after Naomi's husbands died and her sons died, Ruth, a daughter-in-law, said, I will go and be with you. So they returned to a place called Bethlehem, the surrounding area. So Bethlehem became a very important part, and it dates way back to Ruth and Boaz. If you read in Matthew's Gospel, you'll find that the lineage of Jesus goes back to Ruth and Boaz. So from Bethlehem to Bethlehem, God's divine work. And no wonder the songwriter said, O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie above the deep and dreamless sleep. The silent stars go by, yet in thy dark stream shineth the everlasting light. The hope and the fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. So today, I want to bring you a story, a message, a Bible study, if you would, whatever you want to call it, on the little city of Bethlehem. You may or you may not know that the word Bethlehem in the Hebrew means literally the house of bread. Now, this morning, my precious wife last night stayed up and baked me some bread. And the city of Bethlehem just simply means the house of bread. And as a minister, I can build a message on that, a sermon on that, because Jesus himself said, I am the bread of life. Remember that? Now you can't take this home. I'm going to take it home and you'll have to make your own. In the culture of that day, when Jesus was born, bread was an essential part of their diet, especially for the common people. In the Old Testament, there was a statement that the bread of the presence of God, the bread of Christ. It's very interesting to me that bread is such an important part of our society. Let me just give you a couple of statistics this morning that may or may not be interesting. It shows that the number of loaves or packages of bread used within 1 week in the United States in 2020 was 9.77 million Americans used 5 packages or more in a year. Somebody ate a whole bunch of bread. Now, we don't use that much at our house, but maybe you do. It's kind of comical. I remember at home when I was a child, growing up, we were poor, but I never remember us going without food. Mother always had something on the table for us to eat. But a great element of our meal was bread, cooked in various ways. It could be cornbread, just regular cornbread. My grandmother made cornbread patties on top of the stove. We had lots of biscuits and lots of sliced bread, because sliced bread back then was probably a dime or 15 cents a loaf. And if we sat down to a meal and there was no bread on the table, before we could say the blessing, Dad would say, "Where's the bread?" And there was always bread available in our house. So when we think about Bethlehem, the house of bread, when we look into the book of Ruth, as I said, and we find how it developed and came around, and the bread of life is what we're talking about this morning. Jesus Christ himself. You might think that bread is not significant, but when you look at the spiritual aspect of our lives, bread is essential in one measure or the other. But when you think about Jesus being Jesus, the Son of God, born in Bethlehem's manger, He became the bread of life for us. Bread, food satisfies, it gratifies, it strengthens us spiritually. It helps us to grow and to develop and to have a brighter outlook in life. Christ is all the soul of man, as we look at it, needs spiritual significance when it comes to the bread of life. So when we think about Bethlehem's manger, the house of bread, it gives us confidence in the fact that later on Jesus would say, "Look at me, because I came from the house of bread, and I am the house of bread." And you can find your spiritual nourishment right here. I've never seen a hungry man, unless he was sick for some reason, and somebody said, "Sit down here and let's have some supper." And the meal was all prepared on the table, and there was plenty of food and plenty of bread, and a hungry man that stands there and looks it over and sees how delicious it is and says, "No, I don't think I want any of that." How many of you know picky eaters? There's a lot of picky eaters around. Just, I don't want that. When we think about Jesus Christ, Paul the Apostle said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we are all partakers of one bread. That one bread is Christ the Lord. That one bread is Christ the Lord. He is the only bread that offers life, and a decision to receive Him is a decision to partake of the bread of life. In John chapter 10, Jesus said this, "I have come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly." In His departing days, before Jesus left this earth, He met with His disciples in the upper room to have the last meal. You've all seen pictures hanging on the walls of Christ and the large table and the disciples. There was one statement that is made from 1 Corinthians that I want us to think about just for a moment. Paul said, "For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which He was betrayed, took bread. And when He had given thanks, He brake it and said, Take, eat, this is my body." So, the bread of Bethlehem became the bread of life through Jesus Christ. And in the final end, when Jesus said, as you partake of the communion, as you partake of the Lord's Supper, every time you take a piece of this bread, it is a part of me that goes inside of you that will become life in itself. And that's the reason we work toward communion. And coronavirus has stopped that. I tried to figure out how we could have communion today, and I decided it probably wouldn't be the best. But the bread of life. And of course we know that the wine represented His blood, and it all boils down, and it came from Bethlehem, the city of bread, and Christ proclaiming the fact that He was the bread of life. And when it came down to the last factor, it was Jesus Christ said, "Take and eat. This is my body, which I gave to you." And when we think about being hungry spiritually, when we think about partaking of the bread and the wine at a communion service, So many times we do it kind of, well, not frivolously, but lightly. We think, well, it's a communion and therefore it's our religious duty to do it. But that shouldn't be the criteria. The criteria is, remember that this is my body, which was broken for you. They beat him. They spat upon him. They pulled out his beard. They nailed him to the cross. His blood flowed. In agony, suffering, the bread of life was broken until he departed this world in the physical. And they buried him the third day in the tomb. The bread of life laid there for 3 days. There is, if you will use the, forgive the reference here, there lay the loaf of bread of life in a sealed tomb. But the bread of life came back to life again. And he still gives out nutrients. He still gives out vitality. He still gives out everything that this loaf of bread that I have, the ingredients that are all involved with that, he gives back to us again and again and again. Why? Because he still lives. He is still the bread of life. He still is the satisfying portion. When we think about all the beautiful songs God has set in place, the idea of the bread of life, when we think about the beautiful songs that we sing sometimes about the bread of life. And we sing them very sincerely and very honestly, but think about as you face the Christmas season this year, and when you either bake or produce a loaf of bread, take time out to think about Jesus Christ, the bread of life. And as you sing about Bethlehem, think about the city of bread and how God in His wisdom down through the pages of history used the bread of life to give us a message of life and hope and joy. So next Christmas, and I realize this is a little short message this morning, but next Sunday is Christmas program. I trust that you'll get a blessing out of it. We pretty well got it lined out, and there'll be lots of music. So let me say to you, invite your friends and your family to come and participate. And there'll be actually 5 reading parts. I'll do one, and there'll be 4 others, and we'll have